thank you, Miao Yu, for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be in a Chinese bookstore in DuPont Circle and to be talking about my book, but more than that, to be talking about Chinese culture and Chinese history and Central Asian culture and Central Asian history and the Xinjiang region and the Uyghurs and all of these sorts of topics, which normally don't come up so much around here. And in particular, I'm a little bit intimidated to be speaking before you tonight because there's a very strong salon vibe about everything that JF Books does. It's more than just a kind of a book talk by the author in DC. There's a strong tradition and legacy of intellectual exchange that goes with JF Books, and so we're actually really blessed to have that brought to us here, regardless of the content of it. Just to have that style and that appreciation for learning and knowledge to be sort of right here in the center of DC. So I'm very humbled and also honored to have been invited. My book came out a little while ago, and this is that. This is the second edition, which came out in 2021, not that long ago. But actually, the first edition came out in 2011, and it was mostly written before that, because it takes a while for academic books to get out. So it was mostly written on finished by 2008, and covered up until 2020. Excuse me, up to around the year 2000 or so. So I didn't cover some key events in that first edition, including the July 5th events or the Urumqi riots. Didn't get into the first edition. And so as a way of kind of setting up what I'm going to talk about tonight, and because I had this invitation to come speak, I was thinking about the difference between the first edition and the second edition. And so I just wanted to give you a sense of that contrast by reading the very end of chapter 7, which was part of the first edition, and then we'll look at the beginning of chapter 8. So I wrote at the end of chapter 7, Xinjiang is the homeland of many peoples, and it has been the stage for much history. Whether different peoples can agree that Xinjiang is a common homeland for all who live there, as opposed to an exclusive stage for one group or another, will depend on how they choose to understand and use the region's history. It will depend still more on how they grasp the present and the future, and how they choose to treat each other and the environment of Xinjiang. Future heroes can span the distances between Xinjiang, China, and the world, as well as the divides between peoples. But to do so, they will have to maintain a sense of balance. And I had just gone through several examples of people who were engaged in balancing acts, including a Uyghur tightrope walker. Anyway, so that was the note in which I ended the book. And then the new chapter that I wrote just a few years ago, after everything that's happened more recently, that chapter is entitled Colonialism, Assimilationism, and Ethnocide. So there's a pretty stark difference in tone between that, and that was necessitated by what had happened. The last chapter of this new book is much darker. That's, of course, as a result of the crisis that was going on really from 2017 or even a little earlier through the present, really. It hasn't stopped. And of course, all of you here are aware of sort of the main aspects of that. The internment and imprisonment of hundreds of thousands or over 1 million people, and that's continuing even though the camps have closed, but the prisons are still there. Attacks on religion, on language, on free movement, on communication, suppression of births, destruction of cultural heritage, burning of books, and really the complete rewriting of the history of the region. This complete change of the historical narrative about Xinjiang and how it fits into Chinese history, or they wanted to fit into Chinese history generally. That's actually one of the most stark changes since really just the beginning of the 21st century. So I want to talk about this in the context of Chinese history. And as I do so, I want to suggest some changes in our framework about how we think about China generally. So I want to make a couple of points. And one of which is I want to unpack a claim which is constantly made by the Chinese Communist Party, that Xinjiang has been part of China since ancient times. So that's actually easy to criticize, the sort of the part of part. And I do so in the book, and you can go through and we can see, well, there was the Han Dynasty, in the last centuries BC and first century AD, had some outposts out there. And then jump forward to the Tang Dynasty. They had some outposts out there. And then jump forward 1,000 years to the Qing. And the Qing conquered the region and governed it more intensively. But again, there's many centuries and thousands of years in between. So to actually say that this is a continuous being part of China is pretty easy to poke holes in that. And it's very clear in Chinese sources themselves. But more interesting part of that question is the China part. Part of China. What is China exactly since ancient times? And that's something I've been thinking a lot about recently in the course of writing a current book. In a few minutes, I'll talk about that and why that question of what China is important to how we think about Xinjiang in the PRC today. And then the second point, we'll expand on that and this idea that it's not the same thing. It's not the same China that was conquering or moving into Xinjiang in earlier centuries as the PRC is today. And once we recognize that and admit that, then we actually have to look at a different sort of time frame for talking about Xinjiang and its relationship to the People's Republic of China. And that time frame is since 1949. And if we start looking at Xinjiang as part of the PRC, as opposed to part of something we call China that is epical and thousands of years old, then Xinjiang looks a lot more like a colony. And so the second point I'm going to make is that we should start talking about Xinjiang and Tibet as colonies of the PRC. And when I say that, I hasten to add that puts the PRC in company with some other places like Canada, Australia, Russia and Soviet Union, South Africa, Brazil, Israel, and of course the United States. And so when we talk about Xinjiang and Tibet as colonies in the PRC, we should think about these other places where a dominant people has moved across continental spaces into places where other people live. Okay, so let me turn now sort of to the first point, the broader historical discussion. How does exactly the PRC explain why Xinjiang and the Uyghurs are part of China, or Tibet, or any of the non-Han peoples, or minorities? And there's actually two ways that the PRC has done this. I think it's important to note that the approach to this diversity issue, or I guess what you could call the modern version of the Huayi Zhibie, right, of the distinction between Chinese and non-Chinese. They've had two really different versions of that story over time. But underlying that was a historical narrative that was rolled out by a sociologist, anthropologist named Fei Xiaotong in 1989, or I should say, best articulated then. And he used the metaphor of a snowball. And he said that back in ancient times, the Huaxia people, the ancestors of today's Han people, were sort of a core culture, very well defined, like the central core of a snowball. And then over the centuries, the snowball kind of rolled around and all the other people stuck onto it like snow, like we're making a snowman. He didn't go as far as making a snowman, but he just calls it a snowball. It gets bigger and bigger like this. And then, starting in the 19th century, in the crucible of imperialism and nationalism and global capitalism, what was already existing as an entire entity of the Zhonghua, or Chinese people, became self-aware and emerged as the Zhonghua Minzu, okay, the Zhonghua nationality or the Zhonghua ethnicity. And this Zhonghua ethnicity, to Fei Xiaotong, is kind of a super ethnicity that sits on top of all the other 56 nationalities, right? So this is how Zhonghua was not the same as Han. It was kind of bigger than that. And everyone had become Zhonghua as the result of a centuries-long process, but it was a modern national result, okay? So what has happened more recently? We've had a fundamental shift, and really, I think under Xi Jinping, Fei Xiaotong's formulation, while some of the same terms are still used, his formulation has been flipped on its head. And I will read to you one of the slogans that's used very commonly about Xinjiang right now. So, 新疆各民族是中华民族血脉相连的家庭成员. Every Minzu in Xinjiang is a family element connected to the bloodlines of the Zhonghua people. But bloodlines is the key thing here, right? We're suddenly talking about connections, 血统, right? And in other speeches and communist documents about history, you see this as well, particularly in any context where there are Minzu and they're talking to Minzu cadres. They're stressing that the Zhonghua people, since the time of at least the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, they've been there all along. And this allows Xi Jinping and others to say things like, well, the Uyghurs are not descendants of the Turks. There was an infamous op-ed by the mayor of Urumqi, a Uyghur, mayor of Urumqi, saying, no, the Uyghurs are Zhonghua. Or Uyghur children now in school, when they have sort of a catechism that they do with their teachers, and the teachers will say, what Minzu are you? And they say, we are Zhonghua Minzu. Right, rather than saying we're Uyghur Minzu. So this new almost racialist kind of approach is there, trying to explain how Chineseness is this primordial essence that has been there all along, and all of the apparent difference is being erased by that. Okay, so why is this wrong? Let's think a little bit about what we mean by China in sort of ancient and medieval times. I want to give you an example from an ancient Turkic text. The words of the Chinese people who give us gold, silver, alcohol, and treasures in abundance have always been sweet, and the silks have always been soft. In Turkic, the word it used for Chinese, it wasn't Han, it wasn't even Tang, it wasn't Zhonghua, it wasn't any of those terms that we know. It was this word, Tabgach. The Tabgach was the ruling family of the Northern Wei, what we call the Northern Wei dynasty, or the Tuoba. Okay, so Tuoba, you can kind of hear the Tabgach in there. They were a Xianbei people, so Turco-Mongolian speaking, right? Except that was about 200 years earlier. So why are the Orkhon inscriptions 200 years later still calling those people Tabgach? Well, one idea is that, well, they didn't know any better. They kind of looked south, and they saw and they remembered from when it was Tabgach. And just the way the word Kitai has become the Russian word and the Uyghur word for China, although it's actually the name of the people who, the Khitan people who ruled the Liao dynasty, right? So just the same way, it's a kind of a lingering use of another word. They knew perfectly well that there were other places in China with other names at that time, but they still used Tabgach. Why did they use the word Tabgach? Because the Tang emperors, their ruling family, was itself Tabgach. They were Xianbei, but they had developed a genealogy claiming that they were Chinese. So what does that say? That says that even one of these most sort of glorious, these sort of epitome of Chinese dynasties, if you've ever been to a Shenyun performance with the swirling scarves and all this, all that imagery is Tang Dynasty imagery, right? And Silk Road and everything else. That means that, even that period of time, you cannot say it is definitively Chinese, if by definitively Chinese you mean not barbarian, not as well. What this shows us then is that certainly from that early period of Chinese history, right up through what we call medieval, Tang, and even just up to the Song, it's not, unreasonable to ask if North China was Han, was Chinese, or like Western Europe after the fall of Rome, if it was this kind of synthesis of all sorts of different peoples and all sorts of different cultures. So, in other words, we could think about China in that same way as a synthesis of many, many different peoples already sort of at that time. Getting back to Xinjiang then, all of those, and let's call them sort of North China-based states, rather than just say China, right? So all of those states in North China that did expand out into the west, to Xinjiang, did so because they were deeply involved in, or actually were themselves, Central Eurasians. Well, you might say, oh, well, the Han period, the Han Empire, what could be more Chinese than that? How can we connect them to Central Eurasia? Well, for those of you who don't remember, so the Han Dynasty was engaged in this long-term struggle with a nomadic people known as the Xiongnu, or often translated as Huns. You could argue that both the Han and the Xiongnu were actually both formed by the first expansion of this Qin emperor, this first, not Qing, but Qin dynasty, right? Because he came in hot, from the west. He destroyed all of the existing states, the Zhongguos, the central states that had been there, wiped out their ancestral temples. It wasn't just another hegemon kind of pulling them together. He just destroyed them all, created a whole new thing. And of course, famously, he built the Great Wall, right? Well, was the Great Wall to defend against peoples in the north? Well, actually not. And this is very, very clear in the Hanshu. It's very, very clear in Sima Qian. He sent General Meng Tian out with 100,000 people. They marched north. They pushed all of the people out of this region north of the Yellow River and north of the Ordos. We would call this displacement today. And then built the wall to keep them out in order to support colonial settlement of that part of North China. After the Han was founded, they were stuck with the Xiongnu wanting to come back in. And so this struggle was really kind of over the legacy of settler colonialism by the Qin emperor, okay? And so, when ultimately the Qin moved out to Xinjiang, it was as part of this struggle against the Xiongnu. They were trying to outflank them to keep the Xiongnu from getting grain and so on and so forth. But the Tang dynasty, family were themselves Xianbei, but they were closely related to Turks. They were working together with Turks. They moved out to the west into Xinjiang as part of their struggles against the western part of the Turks, what we call the Western Turkic Khaganate. And there's a lot of back and forth. Neither the Han nor the Tang left much of a Chinese cultural legacy in Xinjiang. They weren't there to Sinicize peoples. But what the Tang did, because their soldiers were primarily themselves Turks, they were Turkic nomads, from the Tujria, a lot of those soldiers settled. And so ironically, the Turkicization of the region we now call Xinjiang was promoted, was launched, and to a great degree in the period of Tang occupation, because the Tang were there with their military, who were all Turks. And that's when the Indo-European speakers began to recede and the Turkic speakers sort of came in. So we can thank the Tang for Turkicizing Xinjiang. Let me just move on to my second main point here about Xinjiang as a colony today. From the late 19th century, Chinese nationalists started talking about colonizing Xinjiang, using that terminology. And this was a big shift from how the Qing had ruled there before. The Qing was a big empire, like the Mongols before. They could rule over lots of different people in different ways, didn't need to unify it. They weren't trying to extract anything from Xinjiang until the last decades of the 19th century. But this attitude that territory that one controls should be exploited for what it is worth was filtering in from the West, and from Japan and Russia at this point. Now, Sun Yat-sen called directly for colonization in Manchuria, Mongolia, Xinjiang, Kokonor, which is Qinghai, and Tibet. And he did this in a 1919 book that he wrote called International Development of China. And that was kind of the companion volume to his Sanminjuyi, to the Three People's Principles. But what it was essentially a pitch for Western investment. And it's like, look at our forests, look at our minerals, look at all this deep territory. Please give us lots of money to develop that. He circulated around, and then ambassador to China responded, and actually this is included as an appendix in the book. So this ambassador, Paul Reinsch, American ambassador to China, he responded, well, 50,000 miles of railway and 100,000 miles of good roads, that would seem to be sufficient to engage our attention for any plans in the immediate future. This is right after World War I. There wasn't a lot of capital floating around to invest. So he's saying to Sun Yat-sen, scale it back a little bit, we can invest. That would allow ample opportunity to penetrate the great, rich, unoccupied regions in the north and west, which should be opened to colonization and development as soon as possible in order to relieve the economic pressure of overpopulation in sections along the coast and waterways, and to accord opportunities to bring rich regions of West China into contact with the trade of the rest of China and the world at large. Right? So this is a classic American expression of the colonial impulse. Right? All those lands in the West, well, they're unoccupied. They're not being used profitably. We need to connect them with global capital, right? And by the way, if we've got overpopulated cities, we can move all those people out there too and settle it. Won't that be great? So if we think about various programs to open Xinjiang and the Northwest, in the 1930s under the Kuomintang, Kaifa Shibei was a slogan. And to the extent that they could, they tried to implement it a little bit. We're much more familiar from the late 90s and the 2000s with Shibu Da Kaifa, the great development of the West, which was a big program in China. And of course the Belt and Road Initiative, although it has global scale, it's also continuing the Silk Road in those directions, right? Now, the PRC, I don't think, has ever talked about like 我们要开发湖北省, or 要开发广东, right? You don't kaifa, Fajan, yes, but you don't open and develop those places, right? So the opening, it's still there in the vocabulary. The opening is from this colonial idea, right? It's just circulating from America and other places. All right, so let's look at another historical event in a different way, and that is the fall of the Qing Empire, or the Qing dynasty. I would talk about it not as another Chinese dynasty so much, but I would talk about it as an early modern empire, an early modern Eurasian empire. So in that, it's very much like the Russian Empire or Austria-Hungary or the Ottoman Empire, all of which ruled over many, many different types of people. And we think about the Qing collapse in 1911, 1912 as sort of happening all by itself over there in Asia. But then look what happened just a few years later. In 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed. Austria-Hungary in 1918. The Ottoman in 1922. So we think about these Western empires, although the Russian Empire isn't really a Western empire, but we think of those as all the consequences of World War I, right? But of course, World War I, what caused World War I? Well, there were global reasons for this: global imperialism, global capitalism, trade issues. And all of those underlying factors, if not the war, World War I itself, were definitely part of what was going on in Xinjiang, right? Remember the railways again, and international investment and fighting over that. And of course, the upshot of World War I was critical for the development of Chinese nationalism, of Han nationalism, because it was the decision at Versailles, the treaty sort of wrapping up after World War I, to give German concessions in Shandong province, to give those to Japan. That's what sparked the May 4th movement, right, and the real surgence of Chinese nationalism. So anyway, I think it's important to try and see how the Qing collapse is actually connected to these other imperial collapses. And most importantly, what happens afterwards, right? We're used to thinking about Chinese nationalism, the emergence of the Chinese, several nation-state projects after that, after the Qing collapse. But one of the first things that happened was that Mongolia and Tibet both declared independence, and they declared themselves to be nation-states, each under sort of theocratic Buddhist rule in 1912 and 1913. Of course, at the same time, a Chinese nation-state was declared on the ruins of the Qing. And then over the next decades, there were a couple of movements in the Uyghur region out west of national declaration as well. One in the 1930s, another in the 1940s. And there's actually a short-lived Hui effort to claim a nation-state as well, too. So if we don't forget about Mongolia and Tibet and Xinjiang, and we look at what happens after the Qing, it looks a lot like what happens at the end after the Ottoman, after the Russian, after Austria-Hungary breakdown, right? These old empires which managed to hold together various different, diverse bits and pieces. You take the old empire away, and what do you get? All of this nationalistic sort of shrapnel, people breaking off and trying to have their own individual nation states, because this is, of course, the era of Wilsonian nationalism and these ideas. So that's a different perspective to look at what we now consider separatist movements in China as actually nationalist movements that didn't break free. As it was clear that the Chinese Communist Party and their armies had defeated the Kuomintang, Mao Zedong stood up on the 1st of October 1949. He stood up at Tiananmen on the dais, kind of like I'm standing on the dais here today, and said, the Chinese people have stood up. The PLA, the army, entered Xinjiang after Mao had made that speech, right? The negotiations and ultimately military invasion that brought Tibet under PRC control happened over the next several years. If you look at the map, when Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China, fully 1/3 of what is now the PRC was not yet, there was not under any control of Chinese armies. Okay, so you have to think about, obviously that was a good moment for him to make that speech and to make that declaration. But if anybody thought that 1/3 of China was still not under control, would that have been a moment to make that speech? And I think not, because these places were different. They were colonies to be colonized and developed, but it wasn't the Bantu, right? It wasn't the actual China proper yet at that point. It was after that time that Han population really began to settle in Xinjiang, starting with 80 to 100,000 Kuomintang troops who'd been pushed out there in the course of the Civil War. And they, of course, couldn't escape to Taiwan from Xinjiang. And so they were settled there, and they became the core population of what is known as the Production Construction Corps, or the Shengchang Jianshe Bingtuan. Now, I've described the history of China and the Uyghur region here, in a way that really contradicts, and intentionally so, contradicts the PRC official narrative. And also, I think, conventional understandings, what you'll see coming from the pens of journalists, what you see in the textbooks, and most scholars. And I actually think it would be very important, it would be good if media and textbooks and courses on Chinese history started talking about the Uyghur region and Tibet as colonies of the PRC, with no fuss, just kind of as a natural thing. What can be done about the situation in Xinjiang, right? There was a crisis, it was identified, several governments called it a genocide a few years ago. In the United States, we put sanctions on some individuals, we put import restrictions on some products coming from there. There's concern about forced labor. I think, unfortunately, the impact of many of those sanctions, in some of which took the form of tariffs, many of that has been diluted by the massive implementation of tariffs for no reason whatsoever under the first Trump administration and now continuing even more. But also under the Biden administration for a lot of things which are frankly protectionist, right? I mean, solar panels and polysilicon and many of these things, sure, there was concern. They were being done and sort of dressed up as out of concern for forced labor in Xinjiang. But I think they also serve the purposes of protectionist purposes that is part of the broader evolving U.S. approach to China. I think the U.S. has really little moral standing, maybe some still, but it's a harder argument, moral standing to criticize re-education camps in the PRC in Xinjiang, after greenlighting and arming Israel's activities in Gaza and settler colonialism in the West Bank. So at least at present, it's hard to see how U.S. policy can help the Uyghurs very much. I hope I'm wrong about that. I don't know. I'm feeling less sanguine about it. I don't think that increasing U.S.-Chinese tensions, which could be coming, I don't think that will help them, will help either. So it's easy really to despair in these dark times about so many things. That said, I think it's important to try to imagine what a better future could be like and how we might try to build it and how we might rethink China the same way we could rethink the United States in ways that are more inclusive. So if I ask Uyghur friends, what's the solution? What could be done? What do Uyghurs need? For some, that solution is an independent state of East Turkestan, right? There are people who say that. And I have to say that between the first edition and the second edition of the book, my own feelings when I talk to people and they mention that, my own feelings have changed, and I can much better appreciate that aspiration for an independent state now than I could 10, 15 years ago. And other Uyghur friends have said to me that only when the Chinese Communist Party is gone or is no longer, the PRC is no longer a single party state, when China has democratized, will there be space for Uyghurs to safely be Uyghur within the People's Republic of China. I think insofar as the legacy of US colonialism is not any worse today than it is, then arguably that is due to some level of functioning, if very imperfect, democracy. And that should leave us to continue recognizing and attempting to address colonial evils of the past, as the US haltingly has done until recently. I'm thinking in particular about the very, very belated recognition of the use of boarding schools separating indigenous Indian children from their parents in vast numbers, right? And we're decades behind Canada and Australia in recognizing that. But it did come out, and there were reports about it under Deb Haaland. And there are other places in the world that have devoted attention to what we could call colonial or post-colonial issues. Often this attention only came after violence, after separatist wars or struggles. Sometimes it didn't require that. But we think about places as diverse as Quebec or Scotland, or the Basque region or Catalan in Spain. All of these are places where they've managed to figure out how to manage linguistic difference, cultural difference, religious difference, other things like that, within the political framework of the nation state, and to some extent, dampen down the potential for violence there. And I think, that and the idea of reparations could be we can seriously think about that in the United States. We can seriously think about real autonomy for parts of China. And I think these could be workable solutions without completely recreating, redrawing the map of the world. So I was told a couple of times by Han friends, and these are professors and educated people. This was a while ago. But it struck me because I heard it twice independently from different people. And they said that, well, China could never democratize, because if China democratizes, Xinjiang and Tibet would separate. And it stuck with me, because what does that really say? It's worth thinking, is the price of colonialism authoritarian government forever? And is, owning or possessing some territory like this, that are homelands of other people, is that the price that you want to pay, or is that, a sufficient goal to remain authoritarian forever? Now, it's not as simple as that. It's not as simple as that, of course. But I think it's worth thinking that, the path to true development and true stability requires that people have a say, all people have a say in what happens in their own land, and the freedom to discuss it openly. And maybe we should recognize how colonialism and its cousins of racism and other kinds of discrimination, how that continues to threaten and impede democracy with dire results for everyone, minorities as well as majorities. And thank you.
Thank you for your talk. My question is a terminological one. So as you probably are aware, the term Xinjiang has been criticized as quite colonial, given that it's literally new territory. What are your thoughts on the different names that people give the region, the Uyghur region, or East Turkestan, or Xinjiang? What do you think we should refer to it as in academia, in political activism, or in other settings?
Mm-hmm. Using that, I sometimes alternate, and I'll say Xinjiang, I'll say East Turkestan Republic. I think Uyghur region is a pretty good name, because the real name is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Often the Uyghur gets dropped. I still use Xinjiang because that's the name that we know. I know now it's fashionable to just kind of rename whole parts of the world however the hell you want to. So I suppose, we could talk to Google and see if they want to rename the region East Turkestan. That would be interesting. They're banned in China anyway, right? So I think, not to be too flippant about it. Obviously, names mean a lot to some people, and there are many Uyghurs who find the word Xinjiang offensive, and I understand that. I think that focusing too much energy on the terminology, though, distracts from other issues. So I kind of use all the words that people know.
Considering Xinjiang is a region that have dozens of ethnic minorities, is it appropriate to use a single ethnic name of a single ethnic to represent the whole region?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So no, right. So obviously, I should, sort of have a, global replace Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Tajiks, and other non-Han peoples of Xinjiang, right? And unfortunately, we're often lazy in this kind of settings when we're talking about that. The Uyghur obviously are the most populous, Uyghur and Han are the most populous peoples in the region sort of right now. But certainly Kazakhs have suffered just as much from recent policies and so on. So I think, the word East Turkestan actually reflects that broader kind of grouping. Not everyone are Turkic either, but that's not just the Uyghurs.
I'm curious what you think motivates the sense of control over the Xinjiang region. Besides the American interpretation, which cuts from a more economic standpoint of this is a profitable land, we want to use it, we want to explore and develop it. Do you think there's other cultural or historical sentiments surrounding this kind of the sense of control, whether it's a preoccupation about political might, or sense of unification, or the residues of being under the same empire 100 years ago? So yeah, I'm curious about your take on that.
I think you've kind of answered the question, because all of those are there. Obviously, the sort of economic value of the region at various points for various kinds of things. used to be oil and gas, that not so much. There are other minerals there. It's a very useful place to produce things like solar panels because you can burn a lot of dirty coal there and nobody notices. But I think the legacy, the historical narrative that I was arguing against, that this is a part of China and must remain a part of China, is obviously extremely strong, right? And I'm not saying anyone, I don't think any Chinese person will really give that up. That is, Han Chinese person would be convinced by me that Xinjiang is not a part of China, it should just become a separate state. As I was saying, this ideological challenge that it poses has pushed the CCP to do a lot of things, to talk about things in certain ways, to define itself in a way that it can include Xinjiang and Tibet. Modern China has really been built to an extent that we don't really recognize, I think, enough. Built with this problem in the back of the mind, sometimes in the front of the mind, if you think about, right? And so thinking about it differently is very difficult to do, but there are possibilities for thinking about it differently.
Thank you so much. Thanks for professing your work, sharing, and everyone participating. And next part is our book signing session, and feel free to get the book, Professor.